Welcome dear students. Today our topic of discussion is Origin Theory of Federalism. This lecture will focus on the theory of federalism in a critical way and will also try to explain the origin theory of federalism. The lecture will focus on various theories which come under the heading of origin theory of federalism, like sociological theory, the multiple factor theory and the political theory. A state can be classified as federal or unitary based on the division of power or absence of division of powers between the national and provincial governments. In a federal system, the constitution formally divides the power between the center, national and states, provinces, whereas in a unitary system, power is concentrated in the central or national government, though it may devolve certain powers to the local governments. Federalism is an essential concept of comparative politics. Some scholars have also used federalism to study regionalization and regionalism in international politics and in area studies. The usefulness of federalism has been a debated issue. Federalism as a political arrangement has faced a serious crisis of conceptualization. This is because, as Daniel J. Alzer in 1977 says, there has been several varieties of political arrangements to which the term has properly been applied. Ricker in 1975 advanced this argument further by pointing out that an initial difficulty in discussion of federalism is that the meaning of the word has been thoroughly confused by dramatic change in the institutions to which it referred. Hence, a word that originally referred to institutions with emphasis on self-government has come to connote also domination by a gigantic personal concentration of force. Based on these statements, therefore, it is not surprising that there are varying definitions of federalism, which actually seem to contradict each other. It is this seeming confusion that made Dare in 1979 to conclude that the present study of federalism is in a theoretical jungle. Now, coming to the theory of federalism. Since the first notable attempt at a definition of federalism was done by K.C. Wheeler, most other scholars on the subject matter have used his definition as a point of departure. According to Wheeler, 1953, by the federal principle mean the method of dividing powers so that general and regional governments are each within a sphere, coordinate and independent. He further listed the principle of federalism as: first, the division of powers among levels of government. There should be a written constitution showing this division and coordinate supremacy of the two levels of government with regards to their respective functions. More extensively, he asserts that, first of all, since federal government involves a division of functions, and since the states forming the federation are anxious that they should not surrender more powers than they know, it's essential for a federal government that there be a written constitution embodying the division of powers and binding all governmental authorities throughout the federation. From it, all states and federal authorities derive their powers and any action they perform contrary to it are invalid. In the second place, if the division of powers is to be guaranteed and if the Constitution embodying the division is to be binding upon federal and state governments alike, it follows that the power of amending that part of the Constitution which embodies the division of powers must not be conferred either upon the federal government acting alone or upon the state governments acting alone. It is preferable, though essential, to federalism that the power should be exercised by the federal and state authorities acting in cooperation. Thirdly, in case of dispute between federal and state governments as to the extent of the power allocated to them under the Constitution, somebody other than the federal and state governments must be authorized to adjudicate upon those disputes. Finally, if the governmental authorities in a federation ought to be really coordinate with each other in actual practice as well as in law, it is essential that there should be available to each of them under its own unfettered control financial resources sufficient for the performance of the functions assigned to it under the Constitution. It's no good allotting functions to the federal or to state authorities and devising legal safeguards so that each should be limited strictly to the performance of its respective functions, unless at the same time adequate provisions has been made so that each authority can afford to do its job without appealing to the others for financial assistance. For if state authorities, for example, find that the services allotted to them are too expensive for them to perform, and if they call upon the federal authority for grants and subsidies to assist them, they are no longer coordinate with the federal government but subordinate to it. Financial subordination makes an end of federalism. In fact, no matter how carefully the legal forms may be preserved. It follows, therefore, that both state and federal authorities in a federation must be given the power in the Constitution, each to have access to it and to control its own sufficient financial resources. Each must have a power to tax and to borrow for the financing of its own services by itself. It's clear from a common understanding of federalism that Wherer is quite right in his postulation. However, his conceptualization has been seen as being too legalistic and inflexible. It's quoted by Birch. It is criticized for being a description of American federalism, which in any case Wherer saw as the archetype of federalism. He seemed to have forgotten that even the American federalism was a reflection of the socio-political conditions and history of America and has equally witnessed some changes since the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, when the Constitution was adopted. It is therefore apparent that the American federalism was fashioned bearing in the mind the exigencies of government. It cannot be ideal as K.C. Wherer felt, since every society ought to fashion its own system to make it adequate to the exigencies of government. These exigencies must take into consideration the peculiarities, history, and eccentricities of the local conditions of the country fashioning out the Constitution. He has went ahead to label countries that are apparently federal but do not fully conform to his criteria as quasi-federal, to distinguish them from true federalism. Whereas the legalistic or juridical approach, which has been criticized for being too rigid or rather placing much emphasis on legal dimensions of federalism, while ignoring other socio-political factors, has given rise to many other conceptualizations of federalism. In order to make up for the shortcomings of Verar's presentation, Livingstone took care of sociological and political factors in his own formulation. He thus states that the essential nature of federalism is to be sought for not in the shading of legal and constitutional terminology, but in the forces, that is economic, social, political, cultural, that have made the outward form of federalism necessary. The essence of federalism lies not in the constitutional or institutional structure, but in the society itself. Federal government is a device by which the federal qualities of the society are articulated and protected. In distinguishing a federal society from a non-federal one and the role which diversities play in a federation, he argues that these diversities may be distributed among the members of a society in a fashion that certain attitudes are found in particular territorial areas, or they may be scattered widely throughout the whole of the society. If they are grouped territorially, that is geographically, then the result may be a society that is federal. If they are not grouped territorially, then the society cannot be said to be federal. But in the former case, only can this take the form of federalism or federal government. In the later case, it becomes functionalism, pluralism, or some form of corporativism. The utility of Livingstone's conceptualization lies on his belief that federalism is a reflection of the inherent diversities in a society. It is a system fashioned to hold different nations together in a state, while still allowing each of them have a degree of autonomy in certain areas. It gives room for unity in diversity. Despite Livingstone's effort in freeing federalism from Verar's rigidity, he has not escaped criticism over his own formulation. His formulation is seen as so broad that virtually all countries can, with little efforts, be classified as federal states. Others have also criticized him for almost ignoring the juristic aspect of Verar's conceptualization. Thus, Ricker in 1964 argues that, and I quote, "Even in common usage, federalism is a juristic concept of sorts, and that fact is retained in our definition by emphasizing the existence of two kinds of governments and their separate ability to make some decisions independently of each other." Unquote. To Ricker, federalism is a political organization in which the activities of government are divided between regional governments and a central government in such a way that each kind of government has some kind of activities on which it makes final contribution. Suffice it to say that whether one agrees with Verar or not, the most fundamental thing about federalism is that there must be a constitutional division of powers between levels of government. The manner of cooperation between or among these levels may differ from one state to another, or even the same state at different points in time, to reflect political change in that state. It is therefore to take care of both the juridical and social political factors that Frederick in 1966 posited that federalism seems that most suitable term by which to designate the process of federalizing a political community. That is to say, the process by which a number of separate political organizations, be they states or any kind of association, enter into arrangements for working out solutions, adopting joint policies and making decisions on joint problems, or reversely the process through which a hitherto unitary political community, as it becomes differentiated into a number or separate and distinct political communities, achieve a new organization in which the differentiated communities, now separately organized, become capable of working out separately and on their own those problems they no longer have in common. Finally, he defines federalism as a union of group selves united by one or more common objectives, but retaining their distinctive group being for other purposes. Federalism is on the intergroup level what association is on the interpersonal level. It unites without destroying the selves that are uniting, and it is meant to strengthen them in their mutual relations. Dare quotes it in 1979. So, sees Frederick's method as a round-about way to approach a theory by first describing as federal any form of cooperation organized on special basis, and then trying to make the definition conditional upon the presence of the already mentioned three factors. By so doing, he made the three features as requisites of federalism. Symmetry of academic reasoning have given it its content and its form. Scholars are torn between giving a descriptive analysis of what they have observed in some federations and elevating into a theory and adopting a normative approach meant to set the standards of what federalism should be. All in all, none of the attempts to build a theory of federalism could be said to be a futile exercise. Dare puts it succinctly when he said that on close examination it can be observed that no fundamental disagreements exist among the writers in their divergent approaches to the topic. Each approach is a narrow perspective of the broad theme, and none by itself explains the totality of the federal concept or its dynamics. We should therefore not be bothered about the seemingly anarchy of theories that seek to explain the concept of federalism. Perhaps we may conclude by saying that we all know what a federal system is, but we still lack a generally acceptable language to explain what we know. Perhaps with a little more efforts, we may arrive at a consensus soon. Perhaps beyond the issue of theories, one other important dimension to the discussion on federalism is the reason why different countries adopt a federal system, or what could equally be considered the advantages of federalism. To start with, it's quite apt to trace the origin of federalism as a system of government before looking for justifications of its use in different countries. Now, let's come to the origin theory of federalism. The origin theory of federalism explains the circumstances favorable to the establishment of a federal system, and which thereby seeks to define federalism in terms of the circumstantial factors and forces. The origin theory can be sustained by three categories of definitions, such as the sociological theory, second, the multiple factor theory, and third, the political theory. Now let's discuss the sociological theory. William S. Livingstone is recognized to be the first exponent of the sociological theory. The central thesis of the sociological theory is that it is the federal nature of society that gives birth to the political system, or rather the federal political system. A federal society, according to Livingstone, is one which contains within its fold elements of diversity. Usually, diversity is caused by differences of economic interests, religion, race, nationality, language, separation by great distances, differences in historical background, previous existence as independent states, or separate colonies, and dissimilarity in social and political institutions. One important condition laid down by Livingstone is that diversities must be territorially grouped in order to result in the formation of a federal union. These diversities must not be too great to break up the community into independent groups, nor should they be suppressed to make way for a unitary form of government. The sociological approach is also applied by Wildavsky, who distinguished social federalism from structural federalism. Wildavsky cites the Commonwealth of Australia as an example of structural federalism, a framework devised and adopted to retain the unity of the Australian people as a nation. To him, the United States serves as a good example of social federalism, adopted because of the social makeup of territorial, religious and other diversities located in distinct geographical areas, corresponding roughly to boundaries of the states which united under the Constitution of 1787 to form the Federation of the United States. The sociological view of Livingstone and Wildavsky and others has not been spared of critical scrutiny. The critics contend that Livingstone has merely pointed out the various kinds of diversity, but he has not explained the factors which generate the desires among the diversities for establishing a general government within a federal framework. The chief drawback of the sociological theory is the absence of definite indices and criteria by which a federal society can be distinguished from a non-federal society. This has sometimes led to the paradoxical claims such as the one of Wildavsky, portraying the United States as a federal society, and the other of Ricker, who characterizes the same as sufficiently integrated to justify the abandonment of federalism in preference to a unitary system, provided the American leaders elected to do so. Venkataragaya therefore considers the theory as unsatisfactory and concludes that the idea of federal society on which the sociological theory rests is vague and full of ambiguities, each scholar interpreting it and its bearing on federalism in its own way. Now coming to the second theory, that is the multiple factor theory. Now some students of federalism, Casey Vera and Carl Dodge in particular, have enunciated what may be called the multiple factor theory in order to explain the origin of modern federations. This theory takes into account the necessary as well as the sufficient conditions of the birth of federal systems, where lays stress on A, the desire for union and the desire for establishing independent regional government, and B, the capacity to give reality to the desire. Among the factors that together produce the desire for union, The most noteworthy are a sense of military insecurity and the need for common defense, a desire to be independent of a foreign regime, a hope for economic advantage, geographical neighborhood, similarity of political institutions, and previous political associations in a loose treaty system or confederal union. The desire for union must be coupled with a similar desire for independence of regional governments. This is produced by several factors, namely previous existence as separate and distinct states or colonies, a divergence of economic interests, geographical factors favoring regional consciousness, dissimilarity of social institutions like the civil law of French speaking Quebec in Canada, and so forth. Given both the desires, the desire for union as well as the desire for regional independence and identity, a right kind of leadership with the foresight and vision of statesmen would be necessary. According to Vera, to devise the federal system for accommodating both the tendencies. Although Vera lays down no criteria to determine capacity, it might be taken to mean the capacity of the regional governments to raise the financial resources needed to maintain their autonomy. It is true that the multiple factor theory lays emphasis on a combination of several factors that give birth to federalism, but as it does not adequately explain the creation of federal system by the process of devolution or disaggregation. Therefore, it is necessary to turn to the political theory of federalism, which seeks to explain the origin of federal system formed by aggregation and those established by disaggregation. As an example of the latter, that is aggregation, India might be cited. By the time the Brits left in 1947, provincial leaders who had already tested provincial autonomy wanted to make it more real and substantial without losing national independence to a new foreign power. While the threat of foreign aggression generated in them the desire to build up a common system of defense and protection, they were not prepared to abandon provincial autonomy. The centralists like Nehru, Patel and others wanted expansion for larger governments, unity and security, and were prepared to achieve this through negotiation and concession. The outcome of this bargain was the federal system of the constitution, giving the whole country a strong central government and regional governments of the former provinces and acceded princely states a large measure of autonomy. Dear students, this was all about the origin theory of federalism. Hope you have understood it. Thank you. Have a nice day.